The birth of the Mark child. In the heart of the vast savannah, surrounded by towering baobab trees and golden fields, lay the humble village of Nduku. The people of Nduku lived simple lives, guided by ancient traditions and the wisdom of their elders. Their beliefs were deeply rooted in the ways of their ancestors, and any sign of the supernatural was met with reverence or fear. Among the villagers was a kind-hearted couple, Zubri and Naya. For years, they had prayed to the gods for a child, offering sacrifices at the sacred shrine beneath the great Iroko tree. Though they were loved by the villagers, whispers followed them like shadows, for in Nduku, a home without the laughter of children was seen as incomplete. One fateful evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky burned orange and red, Naya went into labor. A hush fell over their modest hut as the midwives gathered, their hands steady with experience. Outside, Zubri paced nervously, listening to his wife's cries, his heart pounding like the village drums during a celebration. Then, at long last, the cries of a newborn filled the air. The midwives gasped, their hands trembling as they laid eyes on the infant. Bashir had been born with glowing marks on his forehead. The markings shimmered faintly, like embers from a dying fire, forming an intricate pattern that pulsed with an eerie light. The glow cast shadows on the walls, making the midwives recoil in horror. One of them, an elderly woman named Maisha, immediately crossed her arms over her chest in a gesture of protection. "This is not natural," she whispered, her voice laced with fear. "It is a curse." Another midwife, younger but equally terrified, took a step back. "We must summon the elders at once," she said. "The gods do not mark a child without reason." Naya, still weak from childbirth, cradled her newborn against her chest. Her heart ached with love for her son, but fear gnawed at her soul. She knew how her people would react. Soon, the village elders arrived, their faces etched with wisdom and suspicion. Chief Baroza, an imposing man with a long grey beard, narrowed his eyes as he examined the baby. Oracle Juma, the village's spiritual leader, traced the glowing markings with his fingers, his expression unreadable. "The gods have spoken," Oracle Juma finally said, his deep voice resonating through the hut. "This child is not like us. His presence will bring misfortune." Naya gasped, tightening her grip on Bashir. "No. He is just a baby, my baby. He has done no harm." Zubri, standing beside his wife, clenched his fist. He wanted to fight for his son, but the weight of the village's judgment pressed down on him. "The gods do not make mistakes," Chief Baraza declared. "If we allow this child to stay, we risk the wrath of the spirits. The crops will wither, the rivers will dry, and sickness will plague our people." The crowd murmured in agreement, fear spreading like wildfire. "The only way to save the village," Oracle Jumo continued, "is to cast the child into the forbidden forest." Naya let out a wail of despair. "Please, I beg you. He is just a baby." But the elders had spoken, and in Nuku, the will of the elders was law. That night, as the village slept beneath the watchful eyes of the moon, a silent figure crept through the village. It was Maisha, the elderly midwife, carrying little Bashir wrapped in a cloth. Her heart was heavy as she walked towards the edge of the forbidden forest, a place whispered about in fearful tales. No one who entered ever returned. She hesitated at the tree line, looking down at the sleeping child. His markings still glowed softly, as if unaware of the cruel fate awaiting him. Tears filled Maisha's eyes. "May the gods watch over you, little one," she whispered, placing him gently on a bed of leaves beneath an ancient fig tree. Then, with a final glance at the innocent child, she turned and walked away, her sobs swallowed by the night. Bashir lay there, his tiny chest rising and falling, unaware that he had been abandoned by the only ward he had ever known. And as the wind whispered through the trees, the shadows of the forbidden forest stirred. The forest guardian and the hidden truth. The Forbidden Forest was a place of whispers and shadows, feared by the villagers of Nuku. They believed it was cursed, a dwelling for spirits and beasts unseen by ordinary eyes. But that night, as little Bashir lay on a bed of leaves, unaware of the fate forced upon him, something stirred in the depths of the woods. A pair of glowing amber eyes watched from the darkness. Old Man Omori, the guardian of the forest, had sensed the disturbance the moment the baby was left at the tree's roots. Wrapped in a robe woven from the fibers of the oldest trees, his long silver beard brushed against his chest as he knelt beside the infant. He traced the strange glowing marks on Bashir's forehead with a weathered finger. Instead of fear, his heart swelled with understanding. This was no cursed child. This was a child chosen by forces greater than the villagers could comprehend. Omori scooped the infant into his arms, his deep voice gentle as he whispered, "You are not abandoned, little one. You are found." The years of growth. Under the dense canopy of the Forbidden Forest, Bashir grew, nurtured by the wisdom of Old Man Omori. The boy was no ordinary child. His glowing markings pulsed whenever he touched the earth, and he could feel the heartbeat of the forest itself. Omori taught him the ways of nature, how to listen to the wind, how to read the whispers of the river, and how to understand the language of animals. He learned to run like the gazelle, to hunt like the leopard, and to move unseen like the owl. He trained his body to be strong and his mind to be sharp, mastering the art of survival, wisdom, and patience. By the time Bashir was a young man, he could climb the tallest trees with ease, speak with birds that carried messages across the land, and heal wounds with herbs known only to the forest. But there was one thing Omori had never told him, the truth of his past. The vision of truth. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold, Bashir wandered deeper into the forest than ever before. The air felt different, charged with an energy he could not explain. Then, he saw it. A massive stone altar, covered in moss and vines, stood in a clearing. It was ancient, older than the village itself. Strange symbols, glowing with the same light as his own markings, were carved into the surface. Drawn by an unseen force, Bashir stepped forward and placed his palm upon the cold stone. The moment he did, the world around him vanished. A vision unfolded before his eyes. He saw a village, a mother weeping as she held a newborn child, a father standing silent and broken. He saw a group of elders declaring that the child was a curse, their faces twisted with fear. He saw the midwife carrying the infant through the night, leaving him at the edge of the Forbidden Forest. The truth crashed into him like a wave. He had been cast away. Abandoned. His people had feared him. When the vision faded, Bashir staggered backward, his heart pounding. He sank to his knees, hands trembling as he tried to understand. Why? Why had his own family allowed this? Why had they not fought for him? Omori's voice broke through the silence. "I knew this day would come," the old man said, stepping forward from the shadows. "You have seen the truth." Bashir turned to him, his golden eyes burning with questions. "You knew? You knew all along?" Omori nodded solemnly. "Yes, my child. I have watched over you, but I could not tell you before you were ready." Bashir clenched his fist. "They left me to die," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "My own people, my own blood." Omori knelt beside him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Yes. But hatred will only make you blind. I ask you, what do you feel in your heart?" Bashir was silent for a long time. He expected to feel rage, but he didn't. He expected to feel vengeance, but it did not come. Instead, he felt curiosity. "I want to understand them," he said finally. "I want to know why they feared me." Omori smiled, his old eyes gleaming with pride. "That, my child, is the path of wisdom." Bashir gazed up at the sky, the stars twinkling above. He had been abandoned, but he had also been chosen. And soon, he would find out why. A village in turmoil. The village of Nuku, once a land of abundant harvests and clear, flowing rivers, now lay in the grip of despair. The rains had ceased. The sky, once bright and blue, hung grey and lifeless, suffocating the land beneath an unrelenting heat. Crops withered in the fields, their once green stalks now brittle and brown. The village river, which had flowed for generations, had been reduced to a mere trickle of muddy water, leaving the people struggling to find enough to drink. But the worst was yet to come. A plague had fallen upon the people. Men and women, young and old, fell ill with fevers and weakness, their bodies wasting away as if something unseen was draining the very life from them. Children cried from hunger, their bellies swollen from days without food. The once joyful songs of the village had been replaced with whispers of fear and wails of sorrow. Desperate for answers. In the heart of Nuku, inside the great council hut, Elder Baroza sat with a heavy heart, his lined face edged with worry. The village oracle, Juma, knelt before a sacred fire, muttering incantations to seek guidance from the gods. The air inside the hut was thick with smoke, the embers casting eerie shadows on the walls as the oracle trembled. His aged hands gripped his staff tightly as his eyes rolled back, his voice taking on a tone that was not entirely his own. The gods have turned their backs on Nuku, he whispered, his voice distant as if carried from another world. Elder Baroza leaned forward, his voice hoarse. Why? What have we done to deserve this? The oracle's breathing grew labored. You have wronged an innocent soul, he murmured. A child cast into the darkness. The gods weep for him, and until justice is restored, Nduku will suffer. A hushed murmur spread among the gathered elders. There was only one child who had ever been cast away. The Mark child. Years ago, the village had called him a curse. Now, it seemed the true curse had fallen upon them. Baroza's eyes darkened with realization. The child, the boy with the glowing marks. The council sat in uneasy silence, guilt creeping into their hearts. Had they truly condemned an innocent life? The rise of the shadow wraiths. That night, a new horror emerged. A farmer named Keto, already weak from hunger, ventured into his dying field to check on what little remained of his harvest. The air was thick and unnaturally cold, despite the season's heat. As he stepped forward, a black mist began swirling around him, moving like a living thing. He felt his breath hitch, his heart pounding as an overwhelming sense of dread seized him. Then, from the shadows, they came. Tall, formless creatures with hollow, glowing eyes, their bodies shifting like smoke, emerged from the fields. Their whispering voices slithered through the air, sending chills through his bones. Keto let out a choked scream, but it was too late. One of the creatures reached out, its shadowy fingers brushing against his skin, and he collapsed, his strength drained instantly. All across the village, livestock screamed, their eyes wide with terror as their life force was stolen away. Children woke from nightmares, screaming of shadows creeping through their huts. The shadow wraiths had come. And they fed on fear. The village in panic. By morning, half the village was in disarray. Farmers who had gone to check their fields had been found unconscious, their skin pale and cold. Goats and chickens lay lifeless in their pens, their eyes glazed over. Terror spread like wildfire. The villagers gathered in the central square, crying out for help. The gods have abandoned us, one woman sobbed. The forest spirits are punishing us. The child, a voice whispered from the crowd. Heads turned. An elderly woman, the once respected midwife Maisha, stepped forward. Her face was lined with deep sorrow. It is the boy, she said, her voice trembling. The child with the glowing marks, the one we cast away. Gasps filled the air. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered among themselves. Could it be true? Had they doomed themselves by abandoning the child? Elder Baraza raised a hand, silencing the crowd. His gaze hardened with decision. There is only one way to find out. His voice was grim. We must seek him out. The return of the banished one. The night was heavy with whispers. The trees rustled, and the wind carried the echoes of a dying village. Deep in the forbidden forest, Bashir stood at the edge of a riverbank, his golden eyes reflecting the moon's glow. He had sensed the shift, the air had grown thick with suffering, and the forest itself trembled with unease. The village of Nuku was in peril. Behind him, old man Omori watched in silence. He, too, had seen the signs. They will fear you, Omori said, his voice steady. They will not welcome you. But you must go. Bashir tightened his fist. He had spent years hidden in the forest, mastering the ways of nature, learning to hear the heartbeat of the earth. But he had never forgotten where he came from. They abandoned me, Bashir murmured. They called me cursed. Omori stepped forward, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. Yes. But their fear blinded them. Now, they suffer for their mistake. Will you let them perish? Bashir closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his destiny. He had every reason to turn away, to leave the village to its fate. But something deep within him refused. No, he said. I will not. And with that, he began the journey home. Trials on the path to Nuku. The road to the village was not easy. The once familiar paths were now twisted with shadows, the air thick with dark energy. As Bashir ventured through the forest, creatures of darkness slithered between the trees, whispering in tongues only spirits understood. At a river crossing, the water had turned black, riding like living ink. Bashir stepped forward, dipping his hands into the cursed waters. The glow of his markings flared, and the water cleared instantly. Further along, a sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, carrying a voice. Turn back, they will never accept you. Bashir clenched his jaw and walked forward. No force, living or dead, would stop him now. The village sees him. The first villager to spot Bashir was a young boy fetching water from a dried-up well. His eyes widened in horror as he saw the tall, cloaked figure emerging from the forest. He screamed, dropping his bucket. It's him. The cursed child has returned. The alarm spread like wildfire. Men grabbed spears. Women pulled their children inside their huts. Fear hung over the village like a storm cloud as the figure stepped into the clearing. Then they saw his face. Bashir. The boy they had cast away was now a man. He stood tall, his dark curls falling past his shoulders, his glowing marks illuminating his chiseled features. His presence radiated power, wisdom, and something else. Something divine. But the villagers did not see his strength. They saw a curse. A group of warriors rushed forward, capturing him in ropes, dragging him to the village square. Bashir did not resist. He had expected this. Before the elders. They dragged him into the great council hut, where the elders sat in a semicircle. Elder Baraza studied him with narrowed eyes. So, the cursed child returns, he said, voice heavy with suspicion. Beside him, Oracle Jumo stared at Bashir's glowing marks, beads of sweat forming on his wrinkled forehead. You should have died in the forest, another elder muttered. Why have you come back? Bashir lifted his head, meeting their gazes without fear. Because your village is dying, he said. And I know why. A murmur spread through the council hut. Baraza's expression hardened. And why should we trust you? Bashir exhaled, his patience steady. Because the gods never cursed me. They blessed me. And now, they have sent me back, to save you. A scoff came from the side of the room. Lies. The voice belonged to Elder Komori, one of the oldest and most bitter men in the village. We cast you out for a reason. You brought this upon us. Gasps rippled through the room. Before anyone else could speak, a frail but powerful voice cut through the tension. Enough. The crowd turned to see Mama Esh, the village healer, stepping forward. Though she was old, her presence commanded respect. She studied Bashir carefully, her eyes searching deep into his soul. Then, she reached out, tracing her fingers over his glowing markings. The gods have touched this one, she said softly. Not to curse him, but to guide him. A hush fell over the room. Mama Esh turned to Elder Barossa. You asked for answers. Here he is. The elders exchanged uncertain glances. Barossa's expression flickered with hesitation, but he did not speak. Instead, he turned back to Bashir. You claim you know why our village suffers, Barossa said. Then tell us. Bashir straightened. His voice was calm but firm. The shadow wraiths have come, he said. They are feeding on your fear, your sorrow. They grow stronger because you are weak. Because your hearts are filled with guilt. The elders looked at one another uneasily. Impossible, Komari spat. Those are only myths. Bashir shook his head. They are real. I have seen them. They are creatures of darkness, born from the fear that you, yourselves, created when you cast me away. His glowing marks flared slightly. And if we do not stop them soon, they will consume everything. A deep silence followed. For the first time, doubt entered the elders' hearts. Could it be true? Had they truly brought this curse upon themselves? Finally, Barossa spoke. If what you say is true, he said, voice measured, then what can be done? Bashir took a slow breath. I know how to fight them, he said. His golden eyes burned with purpose. But first, you must let me go. The battle against the shadows. The night was eerily silent. Too silent. A heavy fog rolled over the village of Nduku, swallowing the huts and pathways in a ghostly shroud. The moon, once bright, was now dimmed behind a curtain of unnatural darkness. They were coming. Inside the great council hut, the village elders sat in uneasy silence, their torches flickering as the cold air seeped into the room. The villagers who had gathered outside whispered in hushed tones, fear tightening their chests like a vice. Then, the first scream shattered the stillness. A farmer's hut near the village edge burst into flames, the fire twisting unnaturally, casting wild shadows against the night. A black mist seeped from the flames, swirling together into grotesque figures. The shadow wraiths had arrived. The creatures moved like smoke, slithering between homes, their glowing hollow eyes seeking victims. One villager, too slow to flee, turned to run but was instantly snatched by a wraith's tendrils. The moment it touched him, his body froze, his skin turning pale as his life force drained away. Panic spread through Nduku. People screamed, mothers grabbed their children, warriors tried to swing their spears, but it was useless, the weapons passed right through the wraiths like air. The curse had reached its peak, and the village was on the brink of destruction. Bashir stands alone. From the steps of the council hut, Bashir watched the chaos unfold. He had won them. Now, it was time to fight. He stepped forward. The glowing marks on his forehead flared brighter than ever, casting golden light through the darkness. As if sensing his power, the shadow wraiths turned toward him, their hissing voices merging into one unholy whisper. Cursed one, you cannot stop us. Bashir's hands curled into fists. He felt the teachings of Old Man Omori flow through him, the power of the forest, the earth, and the sacred light within him. He lifted his arms, calling upon the energy woven into his very being. The glow from his mark spread, covering his entire body in a golden aura. Then, with a single powerful cry, he unleashed a wave of light. The energy exploded outward, rushing through the village like a storm of pure radiance. The wraiths reeled back, their twisted forms shrieking as the light touched them. For the first time, the villagers saw them weaken, the darkness breaking apart, the black mist dissolving where the light struck. Bashir stepped forward, his glowing eyes locking onto the wraiths. "You do not belong here," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "Return to the void from which you came." He thrust his hand forward again, another pulse of light shot outward, sending the nearest wraiths crashing into the ground, their bodies disintegrating into nothingness. The villagers, watching this display of power, were stunned. The boy they had cast out, the boy they had feared. He was saving them. The village joins the fight. A new feeling swept over the crowd, courage. Mama Esh, the village healer, stepped forward and grabbed the torch, lifting it high. "Do not fear," she cried. "The light is their weakness." The warriors, seeing the truth, lit their spears on fire and charged forward. For the first time, they struck back. Women and children lifted torches, chasing away the shadows. Farmers threw salt and sacred herbs into the flames, making them burn even brighter. The wraiths recoiled, their grip on the village loosening. Hope had returned. But the battle was not over. A dark laugh echoed through the night. The final battle, Bashir vs. Sirocco. From the depths of the shadows, a new figure emerged, taller than the rest, its cloak made of swirling darkness, its eyes red as embers. The air grew heavier, a foul presence settling over the battlefield. "So, the child has returned." The voice sent a shiver through the villagers' spines. This was no ordinary wraith. This was something far older. Far darker. Bashir clenched his fist. "Who are you?" The figure smiled, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth. "I am Sirocco, the Forgotten One. The darkness that has lingered for centuries. I cursed this land long before you were born." Bashir's chest tightened. The village had not just cast him away. They had been living under an ancient curse all along. Sirocco lifted a clawed hand, and instantly, the ground beneath Bashir trembled. Black mist rose, trying to consume him, but Bashir stood firm. The villagers watched in terror. This was a battle far beyond them. Bashir closed his eyes, remembering Omori's teachings. Darkness can only exist where there is no light. He let out a deep breath and focused all of his energy inward. The glow from his body intensified, his markings radiating with the full power of the forest, the land, and the spirit of the ancestors. Then, he attacked. Bashir leapt forward, dodging the Wraith Lord's attacks with agility honed from years in the wild. His hands moved in swift motions, releasing bursts of golden light, forcing Sirocco back. The Wraith roared, striking with tendrils of darkness, but Bashir was faster, stronger, unshaken. Then, the final strike. Bashir thrust both hands forward, calling upon his full power. The glowing marks on his forehead flared like a second sun, and a massive wave of light erupted from him, crashing into Sirocco with unstoppable force. The wraith screamed, its form shattering into 1,000 pieces as the light purified every last remnant of darkness. The curse had been broken, restoring balance. As the last wraith vanished into dust, the darkness over Nuku lifted. The sky cleared, the air grew warm, and the river, once dry, began to flow again. The villagers stared in awe, realizing that their savior had been among them all along. Elder Baroza, humbled, stepped forward. He knelt before Bashir. "We were wrong," he said, voice thick with regret. "You were never cursed. You were our blessing." Bashir, though weary, smiled. "Fear blinds the heart," he said. "But it is never too late to see the truth." The people of Nuku cheered. The boy they had cast out had returned not as a monster, but as a hero. The redemption and new beginning. The dawn came with new light. For the first time in years, the sun shone brightly over Nuku, casting golden rays upon the land. The air was fresh, the river bubbled with clear, flowing water, and the once withered crops stood tall, their green stalks bending gently in the wind. The curse was gone. The villagers, who had spent years in fear and suffering, now stood in awe of the miracle before them. The darkness that had gripped their home had been vanquished, and in its place, prosperity had returned. And at the center of it all stood Bashir. A village seeks forgiveness. As the people gathered, their faces were filled with guilt and gratitude. Elder Barossa stepped forward first, his once proud shoulders humbled. He removed his ceremonial necklace, an ornament of leadership, and bowed his head before Bashir. "We were blind, and our hearts were filled with fear," he said, voice shaking. "We cast you away when you were just a child. But today, we see the truth." He lifted his head, his aged eyes heavy with sorrow. "Bashir, will you forgive us?" A hush fell over the crowd. The people who had once feared him, who had once left him for dead, now begged for his mercy. Bashir looked at them all, his golden eyes calm and steady. He could see their remorse. He could feel their regret. And in his heart, there was no hatred. He took a deep breath and nodded. "I forgave you long before this day," he said simply. A collective sigh of relief swept through the village. Some villagers wept, others smiled through teary eyes. The tension that had once separated them dissolved. Bashir was no longer an outcast. He was one of them, reuniting with his parents. Through the crowd, a woman's cry broke the silence. "Bashir!" He turned just in time to see Naya and Zuburi rushing toward him. Naya, his mother, fell to her knees, clutching his hands as tears streamed down her face. "My son," she sobbed. "My sweet child. I have prayed for this moment every day of my life." Zubri, his father, stood beside her, his eyes red with emotion. He reached out, hesitating for only a moment before pulling Bashir into a tight embrace. "I should have fought for you, Zubri Mahmud. I should have protected you." Bashir, feeling the warmth of his father's arms for the first time, smiled softly. "We cannot change the past," he said, placing a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. "But we can move forward." His words were not just for them, but for the entire village. And with that, Naya and Zubri held their son again, their hearts overflowing with joy and sorrow. A guardian, not a king. As the celebrations began, the elders gathered, discussing what should be done next. "This village owes you its life, Bashir," Elder Barossa said. "Stay. Rule as our leader. Let us honor you." The crowd nodded in agreement, their eyes filled with admiration. But Bashir shook his head. "No," he said gently. "I did not return to rule. My place is not in the heart of the village." He turned, looking toward the forbidden forest, where he had grown strong. "I will stay on the outskirts, helping those in need. Protecting those who are cast away, as I once was." The people listened in silence, their hearts swelling with newfound respect. Bashir had no desire for power, only purpose. The legend of the Banished One. With time, the story of Bashir spread far beyond Nuku. Travelers from distant lands came to hear the tale of the boy who was cast away, only to return as a savior. Children sat beneath the great baobab tree, listening to their elders tell of the Banished One who became a guardian. And the forbidden forest, once a place of fear and death, became a place of healing and wisdom. People who were lost, outcast, or in search of guidance would journey into the woods, where they would find a man with golden eyes, waiting to help them. Bashir had become more than a legend. He had become a protector. Destiny fulfilled. One evening, as the sun set over the golden plains, Bashir stood atop a hill, overlooking the village he had once called home. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the voices of the people laughing, singing, and living in peace. He smiled. He had been abandoned. He had been feared. But now, he had become who he was meant to be. With a final glance toward the village, Bashir turned and walked into the forest, his spirit at peace, knowing that destiny had brought him full circle. The end.